let's finish chapter 34 with section 3, and we'll start off with the alternative to communism in Russia and liberalism in the United States and other places with the fascist alternative. Now, we're going to see socialism start to transform the Russian Empire like we talked about yesterday, but the other political force that's going to sweep across Europe after the Great War is going to be fascism. This is going to be a political movement ideology that'll seek to create a new kind of society and developed as a reaction against liberal democracy and the spread of socialism and communism. Now, fascism is going to derive from the fasces, which is an ancient Roman symbol of this bundling of wooden rods that'll be strapped together around by an axe. In 1919, Benito Mussolini is going to adopt this for his symbol for the Italian fascist movement that will govern Italy from 1922 to 1943. Some of the things that are comparable to Italian fascism will develop and sometimes dominate political life in many European societies, but most notably the obvious in Germany in the National Socialism or Nazism. Now, even though fascism will enjoy widespread popularities in a lot of European countries, it's really rarely going to threaten the actual political order, with the obvious two countries that this is coming from, which is Italy and Germany. So we'll never have the actual overthrow of a parliamentary system. Now, political and economic frustrations are what's going to allow this or is going to have this fertile ground for fascist appeals outside of Europe, and potential fascist movements are going to spring up in the 1930s, Japan, China, South Africa, and in Latin America, societies like Brazil and Argentina, and in several Arab lands. Even though the potential for fascism never reproduced the major characteristics of European fascism, and fascism will remain basically a European phenomenon of the era between the two world wars. Now, when we look at common elements of fascism, we see in the 1920s and 1930s that fascism will attract millions of followers and prove especially attractive to the middle class in rural populations. These groups are going to become radicalized by economic and social cries, and were especially fearful of class conflict and the perceived threat of the potential left. So fascism will also prove attractive to nationalists of all classes, denouncing their governments for failing to realize glorious objectives for which they had fought the Great War for, which we talked about earlier on, but asserting that society faced a profound crisis. So fascists sought to create a new national community, which they defined either as a nation state or as a unique ethnic or racial group. And as part of their quest, fascist movements commonly dictated themselves in the revival of allegedly lost national tradition and differed widely. So we see most fascist movements shared certain common features like veneration of the state, a devotion to a strong leader, and an emphasis of ultra-nationalism and ethnocentrism and militarism. We see fascist ideology being consistently invoking the primacy of the state, which will stand at the center of the nation's life and history, and which demanded the subordination of the individual to the service of the state. And we see strong characteristics of leaders, charismatic leaders like Benito Mussolini in Italy and Adolf Hitler in Germany, that will embolden the state and claim indisputable authority. Consequently, fascists were hostile to liberal democracy and its devotion to the opposite, individualism and its institutions, which they viewed as weak and decadent. Fascism was also extremely hostile to class-based visions of the future promoted by socialism and communism. Fascist movements will emphasize chauvinism, or a belligerent form of nationalism, and xenophobia, which is a fear of foreign people, which they frequently link to an exaggerated ethnocentrism. Some fascist leaders accordingly viewed national boundaries as artificial restraints, limiting their union with ethnic or racial comrades living in other states. The typical fascist state embraced militarism, this belief in the rigors or virtues of military life as an individual and national ideal. So in practice, militarism meant that fascist regimes maintained large and expensive military establishments, trying to organize much of public life along military lines, and generally showed a fondness for uniforms, parades, and monumental architecture. Now, let's look at Italian fascism. What we're going to see is this fascism, including a widespread delusionment with uninspired political leadership, ineffective government, extensive economic turmoil and social discontent, and a growing fear of socialism. And in addition, there was vast disappointment over Italy's skimpy territorial spoils from the peace settlement of the Great War. So when we look at Benito Mussolini, he's going to be the force behind Italian fascism. He will be a former socialist, and from 1912 to 1914, an editor of Italy's leading socialist daily, Avanti, which will mean forward. Then in 1914, he will found his own newspaper, The People of Italy, excuse me, which encouraged Italian entry into the Great War. He's convinced that the war represented a turning point for Italy, and the soldiers returning from the front, he argued, would spearhead this transformation of Italian society and create a new type of state. After the Great War, the one-time socialists will advance this political program, emphasizing virulent nationalism, demanding repression of socialists, and called for a strong political leader. In 1919, he establishes the Italian Combat Veteran League, and then we'll see Mussolini's movement gain widespread support after 1920. And by 1921, his league manages to elect 35 fascists to the Italian parliament. Much of this newly found public support will result from the effective use of violence against socialists by fascist armed squads that we will see known as the Black Shirts. These Black Shirts are going to come into play a little bit later. The Italian Socialist Party had organized militant strikes throughout Italy's northern industrial cities, causing chaos. By 1921, Italy was in a state of civil war. When we go to 1922, he will finally decide in his followers that it's time for a fascist seizure of power. On October 28, they stage a march on Rome, while Mussolini will stay in Milan. He will await the outcome of events. We see thousands of these black shirt troops converge on Rome, and rather than calling on the military to oppose the fascist state, or the fascist threat, King Victor Emmanuel III will ask Mussolini on October 29th to become prime minister and form a new government, and Mussolini will inaugurate a fascist regime in 1922. Now, when we see between 1925 and 31, the fascists will consolidate power through a series of laws that will provide the legal basis for the nation's transformation into a one-party dictatorship. We see in 1926, Mussolini will seize total power and become a dictator and rule Italy as the leader. Now, they will quickly, like any brand new regime, and especially by force like this, like we've talked about earlier, we kind of said this was Stalin as well in Russia, they're going to quickly go try to eliminate all other political parties, curb freedom of the press, outlaw free speech and association. And so we see a special tribunal for the defense of the state supervised by military officers, silence political dissent, and marked as anti-fascist subversives, thousands of Italians will find themselves imprisoned or exiled on remote islands, and some will face capital punishment. He will align himself with his movement with businesses and landlord interests, and he'll also crush labor unions and prohibit strikes in an effort to try to harmonize the interest of workers, employees in the state that the regime will try to establish a corporatist order. Now, where this starts to go in a little bit different sense, we see in 1932, on the 10th anniversary of the fascist seizure of power, Mussolini will feel confident enough to announce that the 20th century will be a century of fascism, but also the century of Italian power. We see racism and anti-Semitism that were never prominent components of Italian fascism, but where we start to see the changes in 1938, the government suddenly issues anti-Semitic laws that labeled Jews unpatriotic, excluded them from government employment, and prohibited all marriages between Jews and so-called Aryans. This development is probably because of his newfound friendship with the dictator that we'll talk about here shortly, Adolf Hitler. In 1936, Mussolini will tell his followers that from now on, world history would revolve around a Rome-Berlin axis. And in May of 1939, the leaders of Italy and Germany will formalize their political, military, ideological alliance by signing a 10-year Pact of Steel. And this Pact of Steel is going to illustrate the strong links between the Italian and German variants of fascism. Now, speaking of Adolf Hitler, let's move to Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. We're going to see that a lot like Italy, Hitler and the Nazi Party are going to play off of the economic issues, obviously the Versailles Treaty for the Great War in World War I, and just playing off the ills of society at that time, and especially when with inflation hitting with the Great Depression. So Adolf Hitler is going to come in contact with the political parties sympathetic to his ideas in 1921. He'll become the chairman of the party known as the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or National Socialism, which will be the Nazi movement. This will make its first major appearance in 1923 when party members and Hitler try to overthrow the democratic Weimar Republic that replaces the German Empire in 1919. The revolt is going to quickly fizzle out because of the police and the arms and gunfire from the police units. Hitler will be jailed. The Nazi movement and the leader will kind of descend into obscurity. We'll see Hitler emerge from prison in 1924 after he writes his Mein Kampf, and he'll be resolved to using new tactics. And what he's going to look at is a path of legality, that Hitler and his followers are determined to gain power legally through the ballot box, and once successful, just discard the very instrument of their successes. Now, we see that National Socialism will make rapid gains after 1929 because it had broad appeal. Hitler attracted disillusioned people who felt alienated from society, frightened by the specter of socialist revolution. We see a growing number of people blamed the young German democracy for Germany's misfortunes, which we kind of alluded to those earlier. The humiliating peace treaty of the Treaty of Versailles, identifying Germany as the responsibility for the Great War, assigned reparations, payments to the Allies, hyperinflation of the early 1920s that wiped out the savings of the middle class, but the suffering brought on by the Great Depression as well, and the unending and bitter infighting between the nation's major political parties. So basically, Adolf Hitler is playing to all of these people and saying that he is going to end all these misfortunes by creating some type of new order that would lead Germany back to the greatness of what it's become. And a lot of Germans at the time, especially lower middle class and the poor, are looking at this return to greatness, especially after the humiliating loss in the Great War, but the responsibility of taking blame for the Great War as well, and then reparations also will go into that as well. So he's going to promise to end all that. He's going to stress racial doctrines, especially anti-Semitism. The Nazis will add a unique twist to their ideology from this. And even though the Nazis avoided class divisions, trying to recruit followers from all of society, National Socialism in the main appeal will be to members of the lower middle classes, ruined shopkeepers, artisans, impoverished farmers, discharged white-collar workers, and disenchanted students. And the impact of the Great Depression and political infighting will lead to bloody street battles and shake the foundations of the young democracy. And the leaders of the nation's Democratic and Liberal parties will grope for solutions to look for of mounting unemployment, but were kind of hindered by the lack of consensus of public loss of faith in the democratic system. The electorate became radicalized, and fewer Germans are willing to defend the parliamentary system as they considered it ineffective and corrupt. When we see between 1930 and 32, the Nazi Party will become the largest party in parliament, and the reactionary and feeble President Paul von Hindenburg will look at giving Hitler the office of chancellorship, promising to gain a majority in the next elections. Hitler will lose little time in transforming the dying republic into a single-party dictatorship, and he promised a Third Reich, or a German Reich, or empire that would endure 1,000 years. Now, when we look at this poster here, this is going to be against starvation and desperation is in Vote for Hitler is what's translated in the slogan here, written on this election poster in July of 1932, federal election in Germany. The election resulted in great gains, as we just talked about, by the Nazi Party, which will garner 37% of the national vote and became the single largest party in the parliament at that time. Now, let's look at the consolidation of power. Under a state of national emergency, they are going to look at all available means to impose their rule and, just like what we saw in Italy and Russia, begin eliminating all working class and liberal opposition, looking at suppressing the German communist, socialist parties, repealing virtually all constitutional and civil rights. Hitler and his government are going to outlaw all other political parties and make it a crime even to create a new party, and made the National Socialist Party the only legal party. So even if you wanted to start your own party, he will make that illegal. So we see that they will destroy trade unions, purge judiciary and civil services, and these will be perceived as enemies. So they're looking at this from purging all of this and legitimately changing the face of what Germany and how it is controlled, and bringing in literally a whole new regime in the way that they are controlling the government. So once they do this and start to purge and take control of, especially after they take control of all police forces, they will remove enemies of the regime, both real and imagined, through just like what we've seen from other places, incarceration and or murder. Now let's move to the racial state, and we'll look at theories of racial superiority, purity, and pronatalist propaganda, or increase of birth rates. Now, we're going to look at the Germany and this Third Reich that looked to pursue this creation of race-based national community, introducing some eugenic measures designed to improve both the quantity and quality of the German race. So, looking at the racial inferiority or for biological outsiders of how to get them out of society. So the racial program of the Nazis will be implemented as early as 1933. Now they're based on a diffuse mixture of racial, anthropological, eugenic, and anti-Semitic theories that will look back to the 19th century. Hitler's racist perception of Jews is going to originate within a broader racist view of the world based on the concepts of inequality of races and the alleged superiority of the of these races, and in turn was frequently buttressed by a perversion of evolutionary theory known as social Darwinism that we talked about. This theory that evolved from England and the United States in 1870s, and being a proponent of social Darwinism, they're going to apply the biological concepts of natural selection, survival of the fittest, to the alleged social and political realities of human society. So we see some social Darwinists argue that several different races are going to be biologically driven to struggle against one another for living space. Paralleling these racial theories was the international scientific, political, and moral ideology that'll become known as eugenics, which will reach its peak of popularity in the first decade of the 20th century. We'll see this term come out from Sir Francis Galton in his book in 1883 of Hereditary Genus, which will reflect a growing faith in science, especially hereditary science, that eugenics will aim at improving the genetic quality of the human gene pool. And we see that this is going to continue to even become more and more exacerbated as time goes on. But they're looking at increased reproduction of those assumed to possess beneficial hereditary traits, and negative eugenics, which is going to discourage the reproduction among those with hereditary traits regarded as deficient. So eugenics was supposed to support was supported by prominent people. We see Winston Churchill, Woodrow Wilson. We'll be looking at this as well. And we see such sterilization of certain mental patients being implemented in the United States, Brazil, and Sweden, and among other nations. And obviously Hitler is going to be a big proponent of this as well. So moving over to the pronatalist propaganda, we see that especially with childbirthing, they are going to restrict a lot of birth control, information about family planning and births, and try to stimulate the birth rate to increase. So even to the point where they're going to legal experts are going to rewrite divorce laws so that a husband can get a divorce solely on the ground that his wife is sterile. And at the same time, the regime is going to outlaw abortions, close birth control centers, restrict birth and control devices, and made it difficult to obtain information about family planning, like we said. The Nazis also became enamored with a relatively inexpensive form of propaganda, which is this idea to create and increase the birth rate. So they set in motion this cult of motherhood on August 12th, which would be the birth date of Hitler's mother, where women who bear a lot of children will receive the honor cross of the German mother in 3 classes. We have the bronze for those with more than 4 children, and silver with those more than 6, and gold for those more than 8. By August of 1939, we'll see 3 million women will carry this award, and many Germans will kind of call this the rabbit decoration. Now, in the policies of eugenics, we see that the compulsory sterilization of 30,000 Germans, abortions illegal for healthy Germans, mandatory for hereditary ill, and racial aliens. Euthanasia programs that will kill 200,000 people with physical or mental handicaps between 1939 and 1945. And what we'll see is this is going to be killing them by lethal injections or starvation. So these people judged but useless to society, especially for physical and mentally handicapped. That now the Nazi eugenics measures will serve as a precursor to the wholesale extermination of peoples classified as racially inferior, such as the Gypsies and the Jews. All right, let's move to the last section, which will be anti-Semitism. So when we look at 1933, the Nazis will initiate a systematic measure to suppress Germany's Jewish population. Nazi anti-Semitism will be based on biological, racial theories, and religious dissent. So the government authorities used religious dissent to determine who was Jewish. So we see a flood of discriminatory laws and directives designed to humiliate, impoverish, and segregate Jews from the rest of society, and almost making them like objects and dehumanizing them as much as possible. We see in 1935 the Nuremberg laws deriving German Jews of their citizenship and prohibiting marriage and sexual intercourse between Jews and other Germans. Again, using this idea of purifying the race, and especially in Germany. And so we also see the Nazi Party in cooperation with government agencies, banks, and businesses that will take steps to eliminate Jews from the economic life and expropriate their wealth, and taking everything that they've earned away from them. We see Jewish civil servants lost their jobs, Jewish lawyers and doctors lost their Gentile and non-Jewish clients. Party authorities also supervised the liquidation of Jewish-owned businesses or argued for their purchase at much less than their true value by companies owned or operated by Gentiles. Now, the official goal of the Nazi regime was Jewish immigration. Throughout the 1930s, we see thousands of Jews that will leave Germany, depriving the nation of many of its leading intellectuals, scientists, and artists. So it's pushing out the brain power of Germany, or at least a portion of the brain power, in losing a lot of those because of immigration. So we see the exodus will gain urgency after what will become known as Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glasses. We see on November 9th through the 10th in 1938, the Nazis will arrange for the destruction of thousands of Jewish stores, the burning of most synagogues, and the murder of more than 100 Jews throughout Germany and Austria. This pogrom or this devastation is going to be a signal that the position of Jews in Hitler's Reich was about to deteriorate dramatically. Although they had difficulty finding refuge, we see about 250,000 Jews will leave Germany by 1938, and those staying behind, especially the poor and the elderly, contemplated an uncertain destiny because it is changing so fast. You're not sure what you can take with you, what to bring, what will be allowed. And even though a lot of Jews are able to get out, there's still, like we said, a lot that are left behind and are fearful of this uncertainty, and especially because of all the things that they are stripping away. But again, going to this purification of Germany and getting rid of a lot of as they would say, quote, handicapped people, as far as mentally ill, alcoholics, depression, all of these things that they think can hamper the race in one way or another. So going on this ramping up of all these policies, and like we said, this is going to basically be a precursor to what we see with the ultimate or Jewish extermination with the Holocaust during World War II. But obviously getting these people on board for this and playing off the ills of society and blaming Jews for a lot of the problems in Germany, especially when a lot of the Jewish patrons in Germany had successful businesses and still were making a decent amount of money where others were failing. So putting the blame on somebody is what was being done. All right, that's where we'll end chapter 34. Hope you enjoyed. Don't forget to like, comment, or subscribe.